Welcome to the 66th class. Tonight's discussion will be on the concept of penology as it is implicit. Some of it's explicit, but we're going to deal with the implications of the concept of penology in the Kitabi Agdas. And of course, this is my own thoughts on it. This is not in any sense, as are any of my talks, as authoritative, but it's something that I observed when the Agdas came out, and I did a presentation at the Association for Baha'i Studies about this particular subject. Because I found it interesting in a number of ways, the way Baha'u'lláh responds to negative behavior, the breach of law, because it seems quite distinct from anything that is currently operative in society in a very positive way, as I understand it. We have about 5 more classes, and then we'll do something else. That is, we will go to probably more miscellaneous topics. That is 5 more classes dealing with the history of the Baha'i faith. And the next classes after this, we will deal with the works, the remaining works in the revelation of Baha'u'lláh. And let me just begin sharing my screen and start the slideshow so I can show you what I'm talking about. The works left to examine are some more works in Aqah. The Loy Hikmat in particular, I want to deal with next time. I may deal with a couple of other works too, but this is a particularly important tablet and of great interest to me because he talks about the influence of philosophers through the ages. And particularly he deals with Plato, whose philosophy based on Socratic thought is very similar to Baha'i concepts in a number of ways. And then after he moves out of the walled city of Aqah and goes to Mazra'i and then to Baji, we have the tablet of the proof, and then a number of works that are similar in structure, of which I will explain in, as a group of works. And the effulgences, the glad tidings, not the tablet of unity, but nor the tablet to Muhammad Hussein. But we will deal with that one. But words of paradise, so the effulgencies, the glad tidings, the words of paradise, the splendors is another. And the ornaments is another. So you've got about 5 works there that are in the same kind of thing, where he has a list of ordinances, advice, so on, that are reflections on some of the teachings in the Agdas, but beautifully and poetically listed together. And then, of course, we've got some in that, and this is a chronological order, not grouped according to the way we will study them. But then you've got some important works like, of course, the Tablet of Carmel here at the bottom, the last work, the Epistle to the Son of Wolf, which we will spend a whole class on. And then some of the other works that have importance, such as the Tablet of the World, and the, of course, the Kitabi Ad and the Tablet of Carmel are both considered charter documents of the covenant. And if you study the Rui Book 8, you will go into great detail with those. So that's to give you an idea of what and then the Most Holy Tablet, we'll look at that as well. So we will deal with about, after this class, about 5 more classes. We'll end up dealing with the class that will focus on what happens after Abdul Baha deceases insofar as the progress of the administrative order based on the will and testament of Abdul Baha. Now, we've already had a class earlier on the will and testament of Abdul Baha. It's a talk called the Abdul Baha as architect of the Baha'i faith. And we will repeat that after we've looked at these works. And then we will do one final class on the progress of the administrative order. And then that will conclude our 2-year study of the history of the Abrahamic religions as they relate to the eternal covenant of this particular era, well, really of this particular cycle, the Abrahamic cycle, the prophetic cycle, the Adamic cycle, as it's called. I said Abrahamic, the Adamic cycle, and the beginning, of course, of the Baha'i cycle. Tonight, we are going to deal with penology, how we respond to negative behavior. And I begin with the parental analogy because as with so many things we do in the faith and attempt to do and understand God's grace to us and God's attempt to be, as we have in the Old Testament, or really in the New Testament, God the Father, the concept of this parental analogy of the Creator. And the analogy works well because it explains to us, if we have raised children, that we have to be very creative when we respond to negative behavior, when we establish boundaries and rules. How do we respond creatively and not do more damage? I remember Hand of the Cause Faizi used to use the example. He says, you know, a child breaks a vase and you hit the child, and now the child is broken and the vase is broken. He said that, as the writings do, that we should never strike a child, that this is not appropriate response. In other words, you just induce more negative behavior and are saying, it's wrong to, you know, the irony, of course, is when the child hits someone and you hit the child and saying, no, you should never hit another person, and then you hit the child. You see the total ludicrousness of that. So how does negative behavior deter the parental objectives for the child? What common responses are now understood to be inappropriate or counterproductive? And of course, hitting is now generally accepted as accomplishing next to nothing and really being injurious to the development of the child. So what do you do? How do you respond in ways that deter negative behavior and are conducive to a positive response? And I think we can derive in some degree from our look at Baha'u'llah's description of responding to negative behavior, some overall concepts of penology from a Baha'i perspective. Because these laws establish a basis for future law, and remember we've discussed this before, that this is sort of a seed out of which will germinate all kinds of other laws and establish a pattern which the House of Justice will follow as it establishes needed laws as they become conducive to treating or dealing with problems that will arise within a community, within a nation. We may well consider that the manner in which the laws are presented and described is sometimes as important as the specific behavior they ordain, especially as these laws prescribe punishment for the violation of law. Perhaps a brief examination of the model of penology implicit in the Kitab-i-Aqdas will demonstrate this capacity. Now, there are only 4 laws the breach of which Baha'u'lláh has, for the breach of which Baha'u'lláh has prescribed specific punishment. And those are the ones we want to focus on. One indication, and I said there are 3 levels of response to laws. One indication that laws set forth paradigms rather than codes is the fact that so many laws involve various levels or patterns of response rather than a single specific victim. Now, this is not just for violations of laws. Sometimes well, let me just go ahead and read you what I've established here, because I think they will clarify what I mean. For example, Baha'u'lláh makes daily prayer obligatory, but reveals 3 different obligatory prayers for that purpose, each one distinctly different from the other 2 in tone and length. Now, I don't mean to imply here that they are in sequence of difficulty or importance. This is never stated, but they are for different people in different circumstances. And perhaps the individual may be in different circumstances, where sometimes the long obligatory prayer is possible, and sometimes you're in a situation where it's not, where you don't have the privacy or the ability to recite the prayer appropriately. Well, then you have to do one of the other 2 prayers. So they're different in character according to the supplicant, and they're different in the way they are carried out. He then leaves it to the individual to decide which one to use. There is no rank or preference in this. And he further gives a number of exemptions from this obligation, and I won't go into those. But of course, if you're traveling and for various other exemptions to certain specific laws. So you see this variability, that there's no rigidity in the way Baha'u'lláh prescribes laws. They may seem rigid insofar as compared to the latitude and laxitude in contemporary society, but in terms of the specific pattern of Baha'i civilization and social order, they are not. Let's deal, for example, with the law of marriage, insofar as dowry is concerned. Now, dowry in the Baha'i law is to be paid from the husband-to-be to the bride. And the importance of this is severalfold, but one of them is that it is indicating that the wife has a right to her own funds, and that she is, in effect, a co-equal partner in this relationship. So it has a very important symbolic meaning. I would say more symbolic than having some particular economic or financial statement. So it doesn't necessarily mean the wife must have her own bank account or something. That's up to the couple to decide. But it is an indication that the bride is her own person, because unlike in the past, where the dowry was paid to the father, or in some cases the reverse of it, where the bride's father would pay the groom. So let me read the law. Marriage is conditioned on the payment of dowry of 19 mithqals of gold from the husband to the bride. However, villagers can pay the same amount in silver. And if the husband cannot afford to pay his bride this amount, a promissory note to his bride at the time of the wedding is sufficient. In other words, the concept of the dowry as a symbol of the wife's right to have her own money seems more important than the precise terms of the agreement, so that the law would never prevent a couple from marrying because they are poor. The law regarding the furnishings of your homes after the passing of each 19 years also contains exemptions. After stating the principle behind this law, that God is desirous of refinement, both for yourselves and for all that ye possess. Baha'u'lláh states, whoso findeth that his means are insufficient to this purpose hath been excused by God, the ever forgiving, the most bounteous. In other words, this is the standard if you can afford it. And as with so many of the laws of personal conduct and refinement, and this word refinement, you will, latifa or latifa, I don't know how it's pronounced, is throughout the Agdas. The idea of personal cleanliness, for example, as one mark of refinement, your speech and your comportment, and of course, your behavior in all circumstances. This idea of refinement has very broad and important meaning throughout the Agdas. The determination of compliance is left to individual judgment and conscience, the same way that the very important law, of course, of the Huquq'ullah is left to the individual to determine, though the means of determining it, the calculation, is spelled out in great detail. It is up to the individual to determine when it is paid, and no one is going to examine your income to see if you've paid it. So it's entirely a law between you and God, as is the law of the obligatory prayer. There are no prayer police in the Baha'i faith. In other words, there are laws that we read last time between the individual and God, and others between the individual and other individuals, and the individual and society. The variability demonstrates the principle of justice in its broadest sense. And by this, we mean that justice can mean anything from the way it's stated in hidden word number 2, the Arabic hidden word number 2, where justice, excuse me, is described as thinking for yourself, following your own conscience and thinking, and not that of your neighbor. So justice means that which is appropriate in any given set of circumstances. While a number of laws offer various avenues of compliance and for a variety of reasons, the abiding rationale for all variable responses would seem to lie in Baha'u'llah's demonstration of the fairness, the justice, and the educative function of law in general. For example, some laws involve a minimal standard coupled with a loftier alternative. Baha'u'lláh establishes the minimum period of time a wife must wait after the absence of her husband when he fails to return after a promised time. Should her husband not return by the promised time, quote, it behooveth her to wait for a period of 9 months, after which there is no impediment to her taking another husband. But should she wait longer, God verily loveth those women and men who show forth patience. And I presume here that the standard that we talked about last time of mutatis mutandi applies, and that is the same as it is for the husband and the wife, or in this case, the wife towards her husband, the same should it be of the husband towards the wife. So you have the standard, and then you have a loftier way of responding. Perhaps one of the clearest examples of the fairness and flexibility demonstrated in the laws is Baha'u'llah's commandment that his followers allow no trace of dirt to be seen upon your garments. He goes so far as to state that should the garb of anyone be visibly sullied, his prayer shall not ascend to God, and the celestial concourse will turn away from him. And yet, in the midst of discussing this apparently severe consequence for being unmindful of proper decorum and comportment, and we presume even when you're by yourself and not necessarily in a meeting or something where you would expect to wear clean clothes, Baha'u'llah states, whoso falleth short of this standard with good reason shall incur no blame. God verily is the forgiving, the merciful, and we should add here, the just, because that is justice. In other words, you do your best. The overall implication of this command would seem to be that God's justice considers every deed according to the individual motive and circumstances, standards which we must presume he would expect the House of Justice to use in devising and implementing its own laws. The violation of law, then let's get to that because that's our main concern. But this concept of variability, we will find, is operant in those as well. In general, we can infer from the Kitab-i-Aqdas that all religious law, whether personal or private, whether civil or public, has as its animating purpose the education of the human soul, not vengeance, not vengeance for the individual or vengeance for society. There are really two purposes that you will discern as we go through this, and that is the establishment of a deterrent to negative behavior, consequences for your actions, and these are the broadest concepts, and the idea of educating the soul of both the society at large and the one who has perpetrated some violation. Throughout, it is the relationship of the individual soul to God and the fulfillment of its spiritual destiny that is the ultimate aim of the laws of religion. So, no important distinction between categories. It might seem then that penology as a process of punishing an individual for violation of law would primarily concern those laws that overtly affect the public good, those laws that protect the rights of the citizenry. But the laws of Baha'u'lláh do not make any rigid distinction between civil or secular law and religious or sacred law and personal law. The reason for this, of course, is that in a spiritually based society, essentially theocratic in theme. Now, it's not a theocracy, but theocratic in theme, makes no such distinction because all law is related to both aspects of human existence, the social, physical aspect and the private or spiritual aspect. They are all integrated in the society that Baha'u'lláh has designed. Of course, we're not there yet, but in certain communities where, particularly those communities where there is a predominance of Baha'i citizenry, these things can be gradually implemented, and you get a sense of what Abdu'l-Baha says about negative behavior as sort of an overriding principle, and that is the idea is to create an environment where being known as someone who has violated law is the most egregious and grievous consequence one could experience of being known as a bad person. Well, today that carries almost no consequence whatsoever. And as I said last time, some people even would find this as a mark of their own heroic stature in a community, that they're to be feared. As we have already noted in the introduction to the Kitab-i-Aqdas does cite three general areas that govern law, that law governs: the individual's relationship to God, physical and spiritual matters which benefit the individual directly, relations among individuals and between the individuals and society. These are the three categories. And yet all of them have this variability I'm talking about. Since all religious law has its raison d'etre, the reinforcing of the individual's relationship to God, and since Baha'u'lláh devises a spiritually based social order, all law might seem to fall within the rubric of this first category, the individual's relationship to God. Yet the obvious meaning here, as confirmed by Baha'u'lláh, is that laws governing purely personal matters, for example, prayer and fasting, are not the proper concern of administrative bodies and are not subject to penology, though the neglecting of these laws may well bring about punishment or consequence either within one's own being as one strives to become spiritual in this life, but most certainly in the afterlife. And you have, as we've cited before, that very powerful hidden word of Baha'u'lláh, that he will forgive no man's injustice. So if we are unjust, even if no one knows about it, we will know about it and suffer some consequence in the hereafter. And that's something we can discuss at length, particularly perhaps in the Q&A after the class. But that is, for example, a passage we've cited in a previous class where Abdul Baha says, if someone is punished for murdering someone in this life, they will not be made to suffer the consequence of that action in the next life. The implication of which is that anything you do in the way of injustice in this life to another has consequence, if not in this life, then in the life to come. And what is the nature of that consequence? Well, we'll discuss that in the class tonight. The point is that the Baha'i perception of what laws are purely personal as opposed to what those that are not is distinct from most contemporary views of jurisprudence and from most Western notions of individual rights and freedoms. The best example of this might be Baha'u'llah's ordination of punishment for fornication. Now, I use the word fornication because even though in the Agdas it says adultery, the note at the end explains by that he means sexual intercourse outside the bonds of marriage, which may be adulterous, it may not be. Something that would be unthinkable in most contemporary societies today. At the same time, that is the idea that you should be punished for having sex outside of marriage. It's a very common thing. Indeed, of course, even the most prominent of luminaries, whether in the political or the popular culture, say they are engaged for 5 or 10 years, have a bunch of children and so on, and this is not perceived by anyone much as being ignominious or sinful. At the same time, Baha'u'lláh makes the law of huququllah, what would seem to be an important means in the Baha'i Commonwealth for taxation, a strictly personal matter between the individual and God, even though he specifies in exacting detail the process by which one determines what one owes to God, the right of God. So, of course, you would say, well, isn't this precisely against what all liberal thinkers would find abhorrent today, the idea of the government being involved in your personal sexual freedom? Well, of course, the idea, I presume, and of course, we will know once such a law is effected, that it has become apparent to the community that this is happening, whether it's through some form of cohabitation or whatever, or maybe the individual brings it to the LSA. So it doesn't mean that the local community has any right to become involved in the private affairs, both literally and figuratively, of the individual, but should it come to be publicly known, or that, and of course this has to do with both the reputation of the faith, but also most prominently securing the religious or spiritual protection of the individuals involved. There are other laws, of course, which may or may not be of administrative concern. For example, Baha'u'llah's strict laws regarding drugs and alcohol are, under some circumstances, personal and private between the individual and God. In other circumstances, the violation of these laws may become the proper concern of the houses of justice, whether local or secondary or the universal house of justice. In effect, the judicial system Baha'u'lláh has devised in place of a code of law is capable of responding to an infinite variety of variables. In other words, my understanding is that there is no real case law in either at the local level or the secondary law. There may be instances that in consultation, the consultative body or administrative body might reflect on what it has decided in other instances. But each case has its individual variables and individual circumstances, as you will see in a few minutes when we come to that slide. He has devised a judicial system to replace a strict code or canon, or even a rigid system of case law. 4 punishments as a pattern for penology. Now we get to the specific cases where Baha'u'lláh has prescribed a specific punishment for violation of specific laws. And I think you will find this interesting, because what I found in putting this presentation together is that these are all, in a way, the same violation of the same law. And I'll show you that as we get to the end of this presentation of these 4 laws. Baha'u'lláh states throughout his writings that justice and order, as well as individual training, derive from the application of the twin stimuli of reward and punishment. That which traineth the world is justice, for it is upheld by 2 pillars, reward and punishment. These 2 pillars are the sources of life to the world. Now, we said this last time, but it's well worth repeating. Baha'u'lláh goes on to remark in the same passage that the application of this remedy to the human body politic is, in this day, the responsibility of the universal house of justice. Inasmuch as for each day there is a new problem, and for every problem an expedient solution, such affair should be referred to the house of justice, that the members thereof may act according to the needs and requirements of the time. In guiding the House of Justice about how to devise future law regarding punishment, Baha'u'lláh does not, in the Kitab-i-Aqdas, make explicit his principles of penology. However, he does ordain the punishment for 4 specific offenses, and like some of the laws previously cited, these punishments establish patterns or models for a future penal code, because in the course of enunciating these punishments, he also alludes to the principles governing these responses. And one of the principles is, again, this concept of variability depending on circumstances of the violation. Perhaps the first most important observation we can derive from the paradigm established by these 4 laws is the rationale behind their selection. Why did he choose these particular 4 offenses to prescribe a punishment? My theory, and it is my idea, you can take it for what it's worth, is that they show a successive violation of the same principle, and the variable responses demonstrate how you should deal with the violation of any law. That is, how you as an institution, not you as part of an institution, are judging such violations. Of all the laws or violations of laws which Baha'u'lláh could have discussed, why does he choose to specify punishment for stealing, fornication, arson, and murder? The most obvious link among these violations is that each represents a different degree of the same fundamental action, the injustice of taking that which does not belong to the offender. In fact, Hand of the Cause Faizi, in a talk in 1974, observed that it is this same principle of justice that Baha'u'lláh alludes to in the medium obligatory prayer, when the suppliant repeats while washing his hands, "Strengthen my hand, O my God, that it may take hold of thy book with such steadfastness that the host of the world shall have no power over it. Guard it then from meddling with whatsoever doth not belong unto it." And that could be the property, or a person, a dwelling, or a life. And this is just my thought on it, and you can take it for what it's worth, as I said, that each one, in each case, you are allowing your hands to seize that which is unjust or inappropriate, the property of another, and the other case, a person to which you have no right, a dwelling place to which you have no right. And then the most egregious of all, the taking of another life. A second possible relationship among these four violations is that they represent a fairly complete range of severity as regards the violation of this fundamental principle of justice. Are stated in terms of the prayer, one lays his hands on the possessions of another, one lays his hands on a body that does not belong to him. Belong, of course, has sort of makes you cringe a bit, because we do not mean that in a literal sense, and of course, to him or her, because this is mutatis mutandi. One takes the life of another or lays his hands on the home, the possessions, and possibly the life of another. A further indication that Baha'u'lláh chose these violations as emblematic of penology in general is the way in which he incorporates variable responses or punishments for each offense. The punishment for stealing ranges from exile and imprisonment for the first offenses to placing a mark on the brow of the individual for the third offense, so that thus identified he may not be accepted in the cities of God and his countries. So again, variable responses. Exile in this case, of course, would mean removal from your community. Well, of course, these days, and that would be the very thing that a robber would want, is to be kicked out of his community so he can go steal things in another community. In fact, that's what most offenders do, is they get the heck out of town. Well, exile in a community that we are envisioning in the future would be a most awful thing. You must be taken away from your friends, possibly your family, and taken to someplace else. And then this having a mark on your forehead. Well, how is that? There's a passage I'll show you later about that mark. And again, how is that to be done? Is it permanent? So forth. The punishment for adultery or fornication is a fine of 9 mithqals of gold, a fine which doubles with each subsequent offense. Of course, it does not take profound mathematical skills to realize that if this fine increases exponentially with each offense, 9 mithqals would quickly amount in a substantial sum for those who become recidivists. And again, you ask, well, how is someone going to know? Well, we've already discussed that. For the crime of murder, Baha'u'lláh ordains capital punishment or life imprisonment. And the punishment for arson, and again, this is arson, we presume where someone is in the building, is death by fire. So in other words, there's another principle we're beginning to see, that the perpetrator is to experience, whether in this life or the next, the emotional trauma that he or she has inflicted on another. And you can imagine that being the most incredible kind of justice one could receive. I remember in reading a book by long ago by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, saying that she can imagine no greater punishment for Hitler than he be aware of and experienced the grief that he had caused others. Should anyone intentionally destroy a house by fire, him also shall ye burn. As the notes to the Kitab-i-Aqdas explain, however, the details in both of these punishments are left to the House of Justice to decide in the context of a future society. The details of Baha'i law, and this is the note I was telling you about that goes into some greater explanation. This is a letter from the House of Justice. The details of the Baha'i law of punishment for murder and arson, a law designed for a future state of society, were not specified by Baha'u'lláh. The various details of the law, such as degrees of offense, whether extenuating circumstances are to be taken into account, and which of the two prescribed punishments is to be the norm, are left to the Universal House of Justice to decide in light of prevailing conditions when the law is to be in operation. So in other words, you might have a different situation if you have an anomalous action. By that I mean, if someone murders someone in a community or society where this has never happened before. And that might sound strange, but I remember in about 40 years ago, when my wife and I went to New Zealand, and we were talking to a Baha'i in the Christchurch who said that he had come to New Zealand to get away from the American society, which was so ridden with decadent values and crime. This was in the 40s when he came. And he said he remembered when the Christchurch is on the South Island, which is the more, the less populated and more of an agricultural community. He says he remembered when the first murder occurred on the South Island. So you see, you can have a society where this is an anomaly, which this doesn't often occur. Well, you might respond one way that way, and you might just respond another way if you're in a society that is in a state of, for whatever reason, of decadence, where you need immediate, swift justice to deter what is going on. So in other words, all the circumstances are taken into account. In relation to arson, this depends on what house is burned. There is obviously a tremendous difference in the degree of offense between the person who burns down an empty warehouse and one who sets fire to a school full of children. That brings, of course, to mind recent news all too terribly, doesn't it? But you see here, the variability of response is dependent on and contingent on the circumstances. Whatever alternative or responses there may be would be determined by the details, or, as it says up here, the extenuating circumstances that are to be taken into account. And this is from Some Answered Questions. Punishment is determined then according to the severity of the crime, the number of offenses one has committed, and other extenuating circumstances. But the essential purpose of penology in Baha'i law is constant, and it is not retribution or retaliation, but deterrence. Man has no right to take vengeance, but the community has a right to punish the criminal. And this punishment is intended to warn and prevent, so that no other person will dare commit a crime, commit a like crime. So never is it vengeance. The variability of punishment. The punishments prescribed for theft, murder, and arson are given only in barest outline. This is from the House of Justice. It is explained in note 42 on page 64 of the synopsis and codification that these punishments are intended for a future condition of society and will have to be supplemented and applied by the Universal House of Justice. The punishment for theft, for example, says that for the third offense, a mark must be placed on the thief's forehead. Nothing is said about branding, so that people will be warned of his proclivities, or hers. All details of how the mark is to be applied, how long it must be worn, on what conditions it may be removed, as well as the seriousness of various degrees of theft, have been left by Baha'u'lláh for the Universal House of Justice to decide when the law has to be applied. Similarly, merely the fundamental principles of the punishments for murder and arson are given in the Kitab-i-Aqdas. Willful murder is to be punished either by capital punishment or life imprisonment. Such matters as degrees of offense, excuse me, let me take some tea. Such matters as degrees of offense and whether any extenuating circumstances are to be taken into account and which of the two prescribed punishments is to be the norm are left to the House of Justice to decide in light of prevailing conditions when the law is in operation. Arson, as you yourself can see from the newspapers, is becoming an increasingly frequent offense. Scarcely a day passes without some building being burned or blown up. Now, this letter was written some time ago. As you can see, these are letters that were written from 63 to 86. I forget the date on this particular letter. But the point is that you had, particularly in Iran, the houses of Baha'is and their businesses being burned frequently, because remember, some of these letters are written after the revolution of 1979. Baha'u'lláh prescribes that a person who burns a house intentionally is to be burned or imprisoned for life. But again, the application of these punishments, the method of carrying them out, and the fixing of degrees of offense are left to the universal house of justice. Obviously, there is a tremendous difference in the degree of offenses. And go ahead, we'll go ahead because I just read that. So, that ends the formal presentation.